Hello and greetings, and welcome to the Richard Watkins podcast. Sit back, relax, and prepare your mind to learn something. We're going to have a great episode today. We've got a very, very special guest who I'll introduce here in a second. But before we do, we have to give acknowledgement to the folks that make all this possible, the Science Policy Action Network, or SPAN. SPAN is here to help community organizations, community leaders, or maybe you, if you have questions. We work to bridge the gap between innovation and stakeholders. And when we say stakeholders, we mean you, your loved ones, community. We also work alongside scientists as they work really hard to explain their research and to communicate the importance of their research, whether you're a scientist trying to work with community members or elected officials. SPAN is here to help advocate on your behalf. If you're looking to learn more about the Science Policy Action Network, visit them at www.span-inc.org. That is www.span-inc.org. So without further ado, let's get right into it today. We have with us none other than Dr. Ryan Emanuel. Ryan Emanuel is a hydrologist and community engaged scholar from North Carolina. He studies eco-hydrology, biogeosciences, environmental justice, and indigenous rights. Emanuel leads a group of researchers and scholars who study water and watery places in North Carolina and beyond. His group also partners with Native American tribes and other communities to understand environmental change through the lenses of environmental justice and indigenous rights. Their work involves research, education, and relationship building. Emanuel aims to amplify voices of indigenous and other marginalized communities who shoulder disproportionate environmental burdens. Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Did I leave anything out?
No, thank you, Richard. I'm excited to be here. And that was a great introduction. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. It means a lot coming from you. I first had an opportunity to hear about your research at the Carolina Science Cafe. I was just sitting there, and first of all, I was just blown away by presenting the research, just to the general public. I always think that is just so awesome. And when I ran up to you, I compared it to like, okay, this is like stand-up comedy, which is hard, but when it's done well, you walk away saying like, ah. I got to go see that guy again next time he's performing. So listen, you got to come back and visit us in Chapel Hill before too long. But thank you so much for being here today. But tell us a little bit about yourself. It says you're from North Carolina. Where about in North Carolina? And tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how it led to where you are today.
Yeah, thanks for that. So, as you mentioned, I am Lumbee. And so our people are from what's now southeastern North Carolina, the coastal plain of the southeastern US. Our traditional homelands span a large area from what's now southeastern Virginia up through eastern South Carolina and even into the Piedmont of the Carolinas and Virginia. My family has lived in what is now Robeson County for many generations, but in the early 1970s, my parents moved 2 hours west to Charlotte, looking for jobs and better opportunities for their family. And so I grew up in Charlotte. I'm a product of public schools, Charlotte Mecklenburg schools through the 1980s and 1990s, had a wonderful experience there, but I also maintained strong connections to Robeson County. My parents ensured that we were down there as much as possible. My grandmother still lived in her home place when I was growing up. Aunts and uncles lived all around. And then on the other side of the family, my father grew up in a household with 13 siblings. And so many of them still lived in the area. And my childhood was full of just making the rounds to aunts, uncles, grandparents, and cousins all over Robeson County. So my upbringing is just as much infused with Robeson County as it is with the east side of Charlotte, where I grew up. And so I kind of had a foot in both worlds, which had good and bad aspects, right? On one hand, I got to see this amazing perspective of um, what a fast growing city in the South looked like during the late 20th century. But I also got to see this really thriving agricultural community in Eastern North Carolina. And I got to see both of those communities evolve over the course of decades. On the other hand, it left me feeling somewhat of an outsider in both places, right? To all of my family, my cousins in Robeson County, I was sort of like the city cousin. But when I would go back to school in Charlotte during the week, I didn't exactly fit in, and there were lots of reasons for that. But to put it short, I grew up with a foot in both of those worlds.
So what is it like, you know, growing up in Robeson County, and then going to, basically Mecklenburg County? And I've always, really found it interesting as you travel throughout North Carolina, you get to some places that, you know, you refer to it by the city, like Charlotte, and in some places you refer to it by the county, right? And you may know the county seat. But what is it like returning to Robeson County, as Dr. Emanuel, compared to kind of growing up there as Ryan? I know, friends and family still obviously refer to you as, Ryan, or any other nicknames that you might have had growing up. But what is it like coming back to Robinson County, just as a person, but now having accomplished so much academically?
Yeah, thanks for that. It is a different experience because my positionality in the community has changed, right? I grew up the son of my parents, and while I'm still known as such, even though I'm 40 something years old, I'm still Lanny and Pam's boy in many places. I have a responsibility in the community now that I didn't have growing up, and that's an expectation in the Lumbee community, as it is in many small, tight knit communities. Right? There's a community investment in young people. Um, the community wants you to get as much education as possible, ideally so you can come back and help the community in some way. And so that was vested in me growing up, and so I knew that there would be some responsibility that I would have. Unfortunately, nobody gave me the specifics of what that looked like. There's no roadmap for what it looks like to quote unquote help your community. Unless you're choosing from a certain number of career tracks that have been that have been well trodden by others before you. In the Lumbee community, that's things like attorneys, educators, physicians. There are not many environmental scientists, or at least not many that I knew. And so coming back as a professional meant that I had to find mentors and role models who could help me crosswalk between what it means to be a leader in the context um, of teaching or practicing law or medicine, and what it means to be a leader and a contributor from the standpoint of a scientific researcher and an academic. And so for me, the first, I would say almost 10 years of my professional career look like respectfully trying to find out what my place was as a professional within the larger Lumbee community. Not just being present as a member of the community, but what does it look like to actually take on a role and contribute in some meaningful way? And so a lot of that was trial and error. We as academics, we're by and large not trained to reflect on our positionality or reflect on our responsibilities to communities. And so I had to figure a lot of that out for myself. And so over time, that evolved from things like going to college fairs and representing my institution, to leading field days for high school students to get to practice some of the methods and techniques that we use in the environmental sciences. and then eventually to taking on research projects that actually attempt to answer some of the pressing issues that are facing our community today.
I want to get right into that, but before I do, I kind of want to get an idea of your academic trajectory. So, after finishing up high school, where did you go to college, and where did you do your graduate work at?
Yeah. So first, I got to give a plug to Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. I was the first class of international baccalaureate students in a public school in North Carolina. So I was a guinea pig, but it was actually a fantastic experience. It really prepared me for college in a way that I can't imagine any other program preparing me. So I was extremely privileged from that standpoint to be able to participate in that program during its early years. I ended up going to Duke for undergraduate, majored in geology, started out as a biology major, not knowing that at Duke, that means basically pre-med. I had no aspirations of going to medical school ever, so I was somewhat out of place as a bio major who didn't want to go to medical school. But I moved around and eventually found what at that time was called the Department of Earth and Ocean Sciences, and still exists today as part of the Nicholas School of the Environment. Now, some of that was due to internship experiences that I had in Charlotte working for the US Geological Survey, which is a federal agency that monitors water resources all over the United States. It turns out that on the west side of Charlotte, there is a regional headquarters for the US Geological Survey for all of Western North Carolina. And I had an opportunity to work for them starting right after I graduated from high school. So Monday after high school, I was out learning how to measure stream flow, make water quality measurements, doing all this sort of thing. Um, and over those 3 summers and 1 semester of work throughout college, I realized that water science is really where I wanted to be. So, geology at Duke was really the place where you went if you wanted to study water science. I took a couple of years off after college to work and strategize and figure out how to pursue an academic career seriously. And I ended up going to the University of Virginia, which has one of the oldest environmental science programs in the US, if not the world. And so I got a master's degree in environmental science, and I stuck around in the same department and got a PhD in environmental sciences. And both of those graduate degrees focused on hydrology, which was one of the tracks that was offered in that program.
Okay, so break it all down for us. For the folks who don't know, eh, including me, right? I don't have a problem making myself vulnerable and communicating my ignorance. What is hydrology, right? And why does it need to be studied? And we're going to go into a lot of, other fields as well, but let's start with hydrology. What is it? And how can we see the efforts and advancement in hydrology around us?
Yeah, yeah. So hydrology, put most simply, is the status and movement of fresh water. So this includes things like water that you can see in rivers and streams, outside your house or commuting back and forth from work. It includes groundwater that is really important, but we don't see it. And it also includes water in the atmosphere. And so it's multiple phases of water. It's water moving around the surface of the earth or over the earth or under the earth. Hydrology doesn't go far offshore, so we don't consider oceans. Some of us work in ice. I do not. Um, Now, hydrology can include things like measuring the flow of water or how much water there is stored in, say, a reservoir or an aquifer. It is also concerned with the quality of that water. Is it clean or polluted? Things like that. And so, hydrology is really the study of the processes that lead to things like droughts or floods, water contamination and the transport of contaminants, um, the availability of water for forests, and also the reciprocal of that, which is the the tendency for forests to act like filters and provide clean fresh water, and for other ecosystems like wetlands to do the same thing. So there's this rich interplay between hydrology and all of these other fields of study like plant science, soil science, atmospheric science, and geology. And so, as hydrologists, we have to know a little bit about each of those domains where we're working, but we have to know a lot about the physics and the chemistry of water and what the water is carrying along with it. And so that's the basics of hydrology.
When you were in graduate school, both your master's and your PhD program of hydrology, what kind of questions were you asking back then? And are they the same questions that you're asking yourself now?
Yeah, so real quick to answer the second question first, I'm not answering a lot of the same kinds of questions today that I answered back then, because back in graduate school, I principally studied evaporation. So my passion was studying how plants take water out of the soil, move it through their tissues, and evaporate it into the atmosphere. And so that whole process is called transpiration. And when you combine it with water that's evaporating from the surface of the earth where plants are not located, that's called evapotranspiration. So my master's thesis and my PhD dissertation focus primarily on evapotranspiration in different types of environments. I focused on both emerging technologies that scientists were using to make direct measurements of evapotranspiration, as well as the ecological implications of the measurements that we made. And one of the main ecological implications that we studied was the relationship between evapotranspiration and carbon sequestration by ecosystems. And so by carbon sequestration, I just mean the process of plants taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, storing it in their tissues, and eventually depositing it into the soil when those plants drop their leaves or when they die altogether. And it's critically important to understand this process of carbon sequestration because it's intimately linked to climate change. And so evapotranspiration was really the process that I chose to focus on for many years, to try and understand climate change and its relationship to ecosystems.
So, so you were studying evaporation and your PhD work, and real quick, are you the first PhD recipient in your family by any chance?
Yes, I am.
So at UVA, when you were going through, hydrology and you got to the point of defending your dissertation, did you have a public defense of your dissertation?
I did, but this was in the era before video conferencing was widespread. So it wasn't like I could give a Zoom link to my parents and have
That's what I
them
was gonna ask.
Zoom in.
What was that like with your family there? So no family, it was just you and your dissertation committee.
Yeah,
Okay, okay.
because we were only one state over, but it was still somewhat of a barrier to travel for family members to get from North Carolina up to Charlottesville, Virginia. So even though the dissertation defense was public, I can't think of anyone who was in attendance at the defense who wasn't part of the university community somehow.
Got it. For folks that are scratching their head, wondering what we were talking about, so this takes on different flavors depending on what department, what field of study you're in, what school. But generally speaking, a person, pursuing their PhD builds up a story over time, a culmination of field studies, experiments, and they put it together in a book, right? That is approved after review by a dissertation committee. Now, at a certain point, the dissertation committee thinks that you've done enough work and says, okay, you can defend this dissertation. And basically, it's exactly what it sounds like, at least in many people's experience. They sometimes have a private defense, which is just you and that committee, right, of, you know, people of authority in your field. And they basically determine whether or not you're good enough to have a PhD at the end of your name. And then, there's also another part where it's like a public defense where members of the university community come by, but also sometimes people's family. And that's kind of like the coolest part because for so many people, like they're the only PhDs in their family. Yeah, there are people who their father and their mother are PhDs, but for many folks, they're like the first or, the only one. And so they've been gone for like 5 years and then, or sometimes more. And then the family gets a chance to see what they've been up to for this like 5 years. And it's usually they're like, "What? You did all this?" Their minds are blown. So that's why I asked the question. Thank you for humoring me and talking to me about that. But so you did your PhD work. Did you do a postdoc after UVA? And where was that postdoc at if you did one?
Yeah, so interesting story there. I had made plans to do a postdoc with a well-known ecologist at Duke. And for anyone who's not familiar with this is yet an additional training step that many scholars have to do after their PhD before they become a professor or an independent researcher. You have a couple more years of training, and you usually have more independence. You can kind of design and conduct your own research, but you're still doing it sort of under the umbrella of a mentor, and you're getting professional mentoring at the same time. So I'd made plans to do a postdoc with an ecologist at Duke, and I had even written a proposal to the National Science Foundation and had it recommended for funding, which would have paid for my whole postdoc experience. But around the same time, my last semester of graduate school, I interviewed for and was offered a faculty position at Appalachian State University up in Boone. And so um, I had a choice between going and doing a postdoc with this prominent ecologist, or going ahead and starting my independent professional career as a scientist at Appalachian State. And I asked a number of folks for advice, and my prospective postdoc mentor probably gave me the best advice. He said, "Look, Ryan, what is your ultimate career goal?" I said, "Well, I want to be a professor." He said, "Well, one of the two options that's available for you right now is to be a professor." I said, "Well, that kind of settles it for me." And so, right after I finished grad school at UVA, my family and I moved down to Boone, North Carolina, and I started soon after that at App State.
Wait, back up, back up. I don't think I knew that part. So you had already started a family in graduate school? Okay.
Yeah,
So that's also important because we're talking like so many different audiences. Like one audience is a group of people who don't really know how science and research is conducted. Another audience can be, graduate students themselves or students thinking about going into graduate school. So yes, it is possible. And it happens all the time that you start your family sometimes, when you're in graduate school. Like I became engaged to my wife. We got married while I was in graduate school. It sounded like you started a family while in graduate school. So even though you're a researcher and you're doing amazing work, your life is still happening.
yeah, and I have to give all the credit there to my wife, who's an occupational therapist and worked and was able to support us while I was in graduate school, because graduate students don't make very much money, right? In some places, graduate student stipends are well below the poverty line, right? So the only reason we were able to do this is because, my wife had a career and was working. I I was a stay-at-home dad for a little while. My daughter was born the first semester of my PhD program. And so it was an amazing experience to be able to have the flexibility to spend time with her when she was very young. Um, it was also just a great time of our life to have a small young family and to just enjoy that season of life. And then my son was born the first semester that I worked at Appalachian State. So right after I started my faculty position, we had our second child.
Awesome. That's interesting. Like, so you got a son that was born in Boone, but you were born in Robinson. As you're telling him and your daughter as well about some of the differences, like what are some of the major differences between, Boone and Robinson County? They're like Eastern and Western. I feel like they should be night and day, but from the parenting aspect, your personal aspect, but then also talking about the professional aspect, what are some major differences that you've seen between Western North Carolina and Eastern North Carolina?
Yeah, just to back up, I do want to clarify and say that I was born in Charlotte. So my parents moved to Charlotte a couple years before I was born. So
Okay.
I have friends and colleagues who are Lumbee whose parents drove back to Robinson County so that their children could be born at a hospital in Robinson
Wow.
County. Uh, I can't say that I was born in Robinson County,
Well, don't,
unfortunately.
don't, no. So now I'm just reframing everything. The difference between Charlotte now, which is it got to be huge between, growing up in Charlotte and how they are growing up or how they grew up in Boone County.
I think the key difference for both of my kids was that they grew up in essentially they were born in college towns, right? And so they were surrounded from a very young age by all of the things that we associate with university campuses, right? All kinds of events and educational opportunities, museums, that sort of thing, right? Like when my daughter was young and we lived in Charlottesville, we could go out and have a picnic on Thomas Jefferson's beautiful lawns all across the university, right? And that was not something that I had growing up in Charlotte. It's incomparable to like a city park, right? Um, for my son, sort of the same thing at Appalachian State. It's a very beautiful campus. We also had a number of great museums, cultural events, things like that were available to us. So like there were a lot of great things about growing up in Charlotte, but Charlotte is not a college town at all, despite the presence of UNCC, right? And so I think that my kids sort of grew up acculturated to university campuses in a way that I was not. And I will say that while Pembroke, in some respects, is a university town, um, the relationship between UNC Pembroke and the community does not really look like any other campus town relationship that I can think of. And that stems from the fact that UNC Pembroke was actually founded by Lumbee ancestors as an educational institution for ourselves. But yeah, I think that my kids had a lot of great experiences growing up close to these two campuses. And then later, as we moved to the Triangle, growing up close to all of these great university campuses here in our local area.
Um, Gosh, so many questions to ask, and it's always so hard. Okay, let me ask this then. So, and we're gonna get into the meat of why we're here today to talk about environmental justice, indigenous rights, but I do want to go back to kind of that Charlotte, that Boone County, that Robinson County. You've now done you either lived or have done research in all three of these places, right? What are the the different challenges in regards to water, right? Between these very different geographical locations, right? So Western North Carolina has its own unique uh, water opportunities and challenges. So too does Eastern North Carolina. Now going into kind of your professional work, what are some of the water differences that you're seeing throughout North Carolina?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And the cool thing about Charlotte, Boone, and Robinson is that they kind of span the three major physiographic regions of North Carolina, right? Mountains, Piedmont, and coastal plain. Um, there are a couple of major issues up in the mountains around Watauga County and Boone that have to do with things like flash flooding. So, like climate change is a serious issue there because in our region, one of the climate change impacts um, is an increase in intense storms. And these intense storms, so where you get a lot of rainfall in a short amount of time, can lead to serious flash flooding issues when you have mountainous terrain. Along with that come things like landslides, right? And anytime you have steep terrains, that's going to be a concern, and it's a concern that's exacerbated um, by the presence of lots of water, right? Really wet conditions. So, that was one of the things that I observed during my time in Boone that was a major societal issue related to water. Now, moving down into the Piedmont, cities like Charlotte also have major concerns about flooding, but it's not because of steep terrain. It's because we've paved over all of the soil, and that soil is no longer available to absorb rainfall during these intense storms. Instead, we've created this network of storm drains that route all of this water to rivers and streams as quickly as possible to get it off of the streets and sidewalks. And so my work at the USGS when I was in college was actually looking at urban flooding and urban water quality issues that were created by this intense area of pavement, right? So cities largely paved over. And so we had flash flooding issues similar to Boone, but along with that, we had all of these water quality and water pollution problems from all of the contaminants that would build up on city streets, right, during dry times. And then as soon as you get a big storm, all the oil, chemicals, bits of rubber, other things that accumulate on those roads are going to get immediately flushed down into rivers and streams. And so you had these very unhealthy surface water systems, that were constantly being bombarded by pollutants and also by extreme floods that could scour out riverbeds, wash away aquatic ecosystems, and wreak havoc on infrastructure by eroding bridges and buried pipes and things like this. And so that was a very similar issue that we grapple with in the Piedmont. Then moving down to the coastal plain, where you don't have a lot of topography, you don't have a lot of topographic relief, and you don't have as much pavement, the issues look a little bit different. Things like drought becomes a major issue, right? And that's also linked to the region's agricultural economy. So we're very concerned in the coastal plain about the lack of rainfall, right? And dry conditions and what it means for our crops and for our forests and for our wetlands. On the other side of that coin, being closer to the Atlantic Ocean means that we're more vulnerable to extreme rainfall from tropical storms and hurricanes. And unfortunately, we've seen that multiple times in recent years um, with things like Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, two huge storm events that came in less than 2 years, right? And these dropped months worth of rainfall on the region in just a day or two. And so it doesn't matter if you have lots of exposed soil to absorb that rainfall. Beyond a certain point, the soil just can't absorb anymore, and you're going to get regional flooding, which is different from flash flooding, right? We saw in eastern North Carolina after these hurricanes, the rivers come up, swell, expand, consume the entire landscape, and those floods remain not for hours like you see up in the mountains, but for days. Areas will be inundated, and that can lead to serious problems with things like drinking water wells, right? You can actually have pollutants enter wells through surface water flooding. Um, you can have agricultural pollutants like animal waste get spread all over the landscape. And in fact, some of our research in the wake of Hurricane Florence showed that pollutants from poultry waste were widely distributed and spread across eastern North Carolina by these floodwaters. And so in Eastern North Carolina, we have this sort of duality of problems related to not having enough water and having too much water. And unfortunately, there too, the impacts of climate change are an increase in both of those conditions, which is kind of mind blowing to think that it's going to be drier and it's going to be wetter at the same time. But that's the reality of where we're headed, and to a place where people are going to have to plan for more drought and more flood at the same time.
Well, you're not like, and I wish more scientists were like you, right? Meaning that it feels that you have this sense of like responsibility, right? To take your work from the field or from the laboratory and bring it to the community in some way, shape, fashion, or form. There are a lot of scientists, but not, in my opinion, this is just mine. You can ask a million people, and I might be the only person who agrees with this, but I feel that more researchers need to spend their time connecting back with the community. You have made yourself visible. You have made yourself visible in the community. What has that been like? And do you have colleagues that would like to do more community work but feel like they don't have the time? Or do you have colleagues that kind of, look down on kind of doing public work and, they feel like, the data will speak for itself. This is my job. My job is not outside there. What has been your experience with being a public person and being, someone who's visible in the community?
Yeah, so I I came from an academic lineage of let the data speak for themselves, right? That's how I was brought up from undergraduate through PhD. And I worked with that mindset for a long time. I realized that the data only speak for themselves up to a certain point, right? You cannot serve up a peer-reviewed study on a platter, hand it off to a decision maker, and expect translation to occur automatically. And it turns out, you know this as well as I do, we have a number of science communicators who are professionally trained in the skills and methods of communication in order to do that translation. Um, but in my case, and with the communities where I work, we don't have a lot of prior relationships with those science communicators. And so I took on that role because I saw this lack of translation between the great academic research that's happening in hydrology and environmental sciences that really has relevance for the day-to-day lives of people living in these communities, and a lack of translation of that work, but at the same time, a lack of respect for and attentiveness to the knowledge that those communities have about their own environments and how it can actually speak back to researchers and scientists like me, and help us do our jobs better. So really, this communication issue is a two-way street, right? We have to either ourselves or in partnership with others translate our work for communities and for decision makers. But we also have to have the humility to know that this is a two-way conversation, and we have a lot to learn from people who are experiencing droughts, floods, climate change more broadly. And so in my work, I've tried to be that communicator and translator, not for everybody, because I know that I can't do that and sustain an active research program at the same time, but I can be that communicator for Native communities in North Carolina, Lumbee, and for our neighbors. At the same time, I want to be respectful and know that, especially in indigenous communities that have lived in these places for thousands of years, that I don't have all the answers and I don't pretend that I do.
And that's huge. I keep kicking a question that I want to ask down the road because each time you say something, it creates a new line of curiosity for me. So I'm going to continue kicking that question down the road because I want to ask this. You were just talking about, you're there to translate and communicate, but what you found is that that communication goes both ways, right? So what is that like bringing in information from outside of the quote unquote ivory tower into the ivory tower, right? Do you experience like pushback? Like how do you, because I imagine that the opinions and ideas that academia, you know, prioritize are the ideas and data that academia generates within itself. But when you're pulling in insights from outside of that institution, what is that like? Are they readily accepted or is there pushback?
The level of acceptance has increased in the past 10 years or so. I would say when I first started my career, there was a lot of there was a lot of resistance to the idea that communities can generate information that that can inform models, conceptual frameworks, et cetera. Right? The community information was treated as anecdotal, right? A nice story to start off a serious conversation about science. We did not treat community-based knowledge as data, to put it frankly. There is a whole field of community science and community engaged science that does this kind of work and has validated it against um, technology rich measurements and observations and things like this, and found in many cases that community based observations are just as accurate, if not more accurate, than the electronic sensors that we use as scientists, right? And it all depends on what kind of question you're asking and to what end, right? So I see in recent years that there's been a growing acknowledgement that community-based information is important, but it's not always clear to researchers how that information can fit into our current frameworks, methodologies, et cetera. And to some extent, that's our own fault because we built these self-reinforcing systems that can only accept certain types of data. And we have to work on certain timelines that we have created for ourselves that are often shorter than the timelines needed to build and maintain relationships with communities. And so, yeah, there are all kinds of barriers, but they're largely barriers that we have created as scientists because we think so much of ourselves.
And we do think a lot of ourselves. I mean, I am special, I admit that. All right, so let me go ahead and ask this question because I look up and time is just flying by, and I'm like, okay, an hour with Dr. Emanuel is just not enough. But I do want to ask this. All right, so what is environmental justice? That's kind of how you started off your presentation. And I kind of want to go right into that. What is environmental justice? And then also, why is it important? Why should we care?
Yeah, so simply put, environmental justice is fair treatment and meaningful involvement of everybody in environmental decision making. To put it another way, it's concerned with equal access to environmental benefits and equal protection from environmental burdens. What that looks like in practice is it's an area of social activism. That's where environmental justice was born. In fact, one of the birthplaces is here in North Carolina, where a predominantly African American community spoke back against plans by decision makers to put a toxic landfill in their community. So it's a social movement that acknowledges and reckons with the disproportionate burdening of marginalized communities, low wealth communities, racially minoritized communities with pollution. It's also an area of public policy that attempts to address these issues and create more equitable circumstances for everybody. And it's also an area of it's an area of research. And part of that research involves quantifying these disparities, trying to understand the connections between pollution and human health. Another side of that research involves close study of the procedures, the barriers to participation, whose values matter when we make decisions about the environment, and what are the underlying structures that perpetuate inequities or help to eliminate or mediate them. And so it's a very rich, broad, interdisciplinary field of study because these problems are so complex and involve everything from human health exposures to pollutants to white supremacist policies that were enacted decades earlier, but still have these lag effects that impact society today.
So when you do this type of research, though, you find, for lack of a better term, sometimes facts and observations that may be inconvenient, right? That you might have to communicate to a big player in the community, a big employer of the community, where you have, community members who are, affected by the plant, by the factory or whatever. But that factory or that plant is also the number one employer of the community. As a researcher, how do you square that circle? Because that seems to be a significant rub that you may uncover.
This is huge, and this is a common story. It happens over and over again, where communities are dependent on the very industry that is creating hazardous or polluting or otherwise harmful conditions for them, right? And so in these cases, it's important to do a couple of things. You have to identify and acknowledge these harms where they exist, and the community has to be aware that pollution or some kind of hazard is there, and it has to be disclosed. And at the same time, we have to start discussions through research or through policy work about the conditions that led that community to become dependent on this type of industry in the first place. And then what do we do about it? And the what do we do about it question is probably the most important one, but it's also the hardest question to answer. And that is not a question that can be addressed in the isolation of the ivory tower, in my opinion, right? There's a lot of theoretical work that comes out of public policy and the social sciences on how we ought to address this issue. But in practice, it's going to look different for every community. And this is where the crosstalk between communities and researchers becomes extremely important. And so, in my view, if I can just help to facilitate those conversations, make sure they're happening at all, because oftentimes we're just reluctant to have these conversations on both sides, right? Um, the corporations, as you can imagine, don't want to have these conversations in the first place in many cases. In some cases, they do. And community members oftentimes are rightly putting their attention to their immediate needs and concerns, and simply don't have the bandwidth to have these kinds of conversations because they're already occupied with so many different issues that this is just one more thing that you're going to put on their plate and ask them to come to a meeting or discuss or write a letter or something like this. So these are really hard, but they're conversations that we have to have. And so in addition to being a scientist, one of the roles that I play is as someone who tries to spur these conversations in whatever form that I can, formally or informally.
Now I want to get into please forgive me for accelerating kind of the conversation because I just want to get so many things in there, and we're gonna have to have you back. But now let's get into what is meant by indigenous rights. I read in your brief bio, that is a huge part of your work. What are indigenous rights? Who are the indigenous? Yeah, that's the question, right? What are indigenous rights and who are the indigenous?
Yeah, so indigenous peoples live around the world today, and they're generally acknowledged to be the first peoples of a place, right? So people who have lived somewhere from in what many of us say time immemorial, right? Since time out of mind, right? There was never a time in our history that we did not live in this place. And so if you go around the world, you will encounter communities worldwide who have that situation. And those are indigenous peoples, right? In the United States, we often refer to indigenous peoples as Native Americans, American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, right? And we can apply different terms outside of the United States. So these are indigenous peoples, the first peoples. Indigenous rights acknowledge that indigenous peoples exist as collectives. So it's not that, Ryan has lived right here for his whole life and going back generations for thousands of years. It's that I'm part of a community, and that community is a self-determined entity. It's a polity, right? It's a political entity that has existed, in our case, since before the formation of the United States, right? And so indigenous rights acknowledges that these entities ought to be able to make decisions for themselves, participate in other kinds of decision-making processes that are important for the future of that community as a whole. And so indigenous rights are about collective rights. And one of the key principles of indigenous rights is the idea that these collectives should have free, prior, and informed consent when a decision is on the table that's going to impact their communities, their livelihoods, or their connections to the places that they have lived since time immemorial. And so this terminology, free, prior, and informed consent, actually comes from an international agreement called the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which the US is a party to, right? So this framework of free, prior, and informed consent is really the ideal for what indigenous rights should look like in practice when they're juxtaposed against the actions of national governments, state governments, corporations, and other actors. So indigenous rights are all about the extent to which indigenous peoples can have the freedom to make the decisions that are best for their own communities.
And right now, as we speak, what are in North Carolina, um, maybe specifically, what are some of the major challenges that indigenous folks of North Carolina are faced with, and for the listeners that are learning about it for the first time, what can they do to participate? What can they do to educate themselves?
Yeah. So some people know this, but North Carolina has one of the largest indigenous populations in the United States. For many years, we had the largest population east of the Mississippi River. But in the last census, we were slightly edged out by the state of New York, right? Which is saying something because New York has a huge population. Suffice it to say, North Carolina's indigenous population is made up mostly of citizens of 8 tribes that are recognized by the state and or federal government. Smaller fraction belong to communities that have no recognition status whatsoever. And these political recognition statuses actually create one of the major burdens for indigenous peoples in North Carolina today. The way federal law is set up is that indigenous peoples only have rights to participate collectively in environmental decision making, in issues around repatriation of human remains and artifacts if they have full recognition by the federal government. So there's an entire legal framework in the United States that attempts, in some respects, fails to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. But by and large, that framework does not include indigenous peoples that do not have full federal recognition. So that includes the majority of the tribes in North Carolina and probably 80 to 85% of the indigenous population. Many of these tribes have recognition by the state of North Carolina going back decades or even a century or longer in the case of the Lumbees. And the Lumbees also have this weird half measure of recognition where federal law was passed in the 1950s acknowledging that we're American Indians, but preventing the tribe from having this formal relationship with the United States. So it's a really weird legal and political situation that ends up rendering many indigenous peoples invisible to laws and policies that would otherwise give them a modicum of protection and inclusion in these really important conversations about the future of North Carolina. And I'll add to that that the state of North Carolina, even though we recognize a number of tribes and say that we have formal relationships between the state and these tribes, the state has no formal policies of what engagement or inclusion should look like between the state government and tribal collectives or governments or things like this.
Wow, man, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. On my end, it's always kind of difficult to really figure out how to ask the questions and not let my own personal curiosity steer me off course onto a tangent. And so, for the most part, I'm flying this airplane as I am building it. And because I do that, I sometimes walk away and I'm thinking, wait, I should have asked this question or should have asked that question. And I start kicking myself. But I want to take this opportunity in the last moments that I have with you. Were there any topics or questions that you were hoping to go over, you were hoping to be asked that you weren't asked? I want to give you space right here, right now to maybe talk about something that is important to you that we didn't get a chance to go into this interview. Anything like that on your mind?
Yeah, thanks for that, Richard. The only thing I would add is that one of the best things that people can do to participate, to be involved, is to learn more about Indigenous peoples in North Carolina or wherever it is that you come from. And so, if you're in North Carolina, or if you're from North Carolina, or just interested in this region, I just wrote a book that covers environmental justice and indigenous rights through the lens of North Carolina tribes. And that book is out now. And so I just want to give a plug for that. It's called On the Swamp, Fighting for Indigenous Environmental Justice. And it was just published by the University of North Carolina Press.
Awesome. Well, you heard that, everyone. Go out there, buy the book. Dr. Ryan Emanuel, Duke University. Thank you so much for being with us today. It was an honor and privilege to have you with us. Thank you so much for everything you do and spending a little bit of your time with the Richard Watkins podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Emanuel.
Thank you, Richard. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.